Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Michael Harris, author of Germantown.
Michael Harris is the author of Germantown, A Military History at the Battle of Philadelphia, October 4th, 1777. How have historians viewed the Battle of Germantown? How does it fit into the larger historical picture of the war?
It's usually overshadowed by Saratoga and even Brandywine. But when you start to really dive into the primary sources, the French government in particular at the time viewed it almost as important as Saratoga for creating the alliance between our two governments.
Now, give us a sense of what was going on in the Revolution at the time that this battle took place.
Okay, so the Battle of Germantown is part of a larger campaign known as the Philadelphia Campaign in 1777, where William Howe, the British commander, took about an 18,000 man force by sea from New York up the Chesapeake Bay, and then through a series of maneuvers and engagements, he captures Philadelphia on September 26, 1777, and Germantown takes place not long after that. But at the same time, there's also a campaign taking place in upstate New York, where another British general, his name's John Burgoyne, leads a force south from Canada, captures Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, and ultimately ends up in an engagement with other Continental troops at Saratoga. So it's very important to realize that the Saratoga campaign is taking place at the same time as the fighting around Philadelphia.
So the early part of the war took place in the area around Boston and on Long Island and New York City. Why was the shift made down to Pennsylvania?
That's a good question. At the end of the 1776 campaign, after the Battle of Long Island and White Plains and the capture of Fort Washington on upstate Manhattan, or the upper end of Manhattan Island, William Howe, the British commander in North America, was sort of shocked at how easily he pushed the Continentals across New Jersey. And he started to change his thinking, because originally the whole point of capturing New York was to divide New England off from the rest of the colonies. And so if they could capture the Lake Champlain Hudson River corridor, they, in theory, would split off New England, which many in the British government thought was the causes of all the problems. So the capture of New York was a phase of that plan. But then Washington retreats across New Jersey, and they're sort of easily able to push them across the Delaware River in early December or mid-December 1776. And so Howe started to shift his thinking, where maybe I can go capture Philadelphia, where in the traditional European mindset, if you capture your enemy's capital, you win the war. And so he shifts his thinking into, for 1777, I'm going to go capture Philadelphia, but I'll get back in time to help Burgoyne later in the campaign season. And so that's sort of the origin of the Philadelphia campaign.
So at this time, what was the state of George Washington's army?
Rebuilding, starting over in a sense. The army that fought in 1776 had 1 year enlistments. And so throughout the tail end of the 1776 campaign, right on up through the battles of Trenton and Princeton, they're just bleeding soldiers. They're just leaving and going home. And so over the winter, while they're camped up in Morristown, New Jersey, they have to almost start from scratch. They create 3-year enlistments or for the war, and they create new regiments and brigades and divisions. And while some of the officers and NCOs do re-enlist from the 1776 campaign, many of the guys that fight in 77 had not fought in 1776. It's basically a brand new army that they're training on the fly, because they're not going to get that proper training until Valley Forge after the campaign's over. So it's a very infantile army in a sense, logistically, tactically, training-wise, experience-wise, that they go through this campaign with.
So you mentioned that the Valley Forge was like the key moment for professionalized training.
Mm-hmm.
Why weren't they able to train like that before?
Because the Army, they're not together. So when they go into winter quarters after the battles of Trenton and Princeton, there's, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but there's less than 3,000 guys. And so they have to build that Army up. And literally throughout the year, there are recruits coming into the camps. When they embark on the campaign in the early stages of it in June, there's 11,000 of them. By the time they get to Brandywine, there's 16,000 of them. And there's still roughly 15 to 16,000 of them at Germantown. So there's just never enough downtime to properly train them. So they're getting experience literally as time goes on in these minor skirmishes and engagements and the larger battles like Brandywine and Germantown. But they're not going to get that professional training until Valley Forge.
Had George Washington commanded a force of this size before?
The Army is pretty big for the 1776 campaign. Again, it's not my area of expertise. Off the top of my head, it's numbers-wise, it's a little bit bigger, but they're never all together for one battle in the 76 campaign. Like the Army on paper is much larger, but they never get 15, 16,000 of them into a single engagement like they will at Brandywine and Germantown.
So the two commanders that we'll be talking about here, George Washington, of course, and then William Howe on the British side, what were their personalities like? What kind of a commander was William Howe?
That's a good question. Howe is more of an administrative guy. He's also a brilliant tactician. He had learned in the French and Indian War that they couldn't use traditional European tactics against the Native Americans and the French. And so he develops this light infantry concept where the guys fight at arm's length or 2 arms length and using the woods and the terrain to their advantage. He actually writes drill manuals in between the French and Indian War and the Revolution that is adopted by the British military. And so a lot of those ideas will infiltrate the British Army prior to the American Revolution. So he's brilliant in that way, but he also knows his opponent. He knows he doesn't want to make a frontal assault. He had witnessed the disaster at Bunker Hill early in the war, where the British lost a lot of hard-to-replace, well-trained troops in a frontal assault. And so he's going to adopt this flanking tactic throughout the war. He uses it multiple times, including at the Battle of Long Island and Brandywine, where he sends maybe half of his force into what's going to look like a frontal assault to Washington, but that's really just a delaying tactic while another chunk of the Army, roughly half, is going to make a wide flanking maneuver to get behind Washington's rear. That's how he wins Long Island. That's how he wins Brandywine, because he doesn't want to make that frontal assault. He's trusted by his men. He's well respected. He's a member of Parliament. So he's a guy that's trusted and is gonna, but he's also careful because he doesn't want to lose too many guys that are hard to replace. So he also has a history after a victory of not following up that victory with a strong pursuit because he wants his men to recover, get resupplied, and not string them out too much where they might die of fatigue or disease. So he also comes under criticism for that. Washington does not have the experience of Howe. He had not gone to any military schools. He was not a British Army officer prior to the American Revolution. Now, he does lead militia forces famously in the French and Indian War, but never large forces like he will have to deal with in the American Revolution. He deals with a lot of distrust amongst senior and mid-level officers. There'll be a movement to remove him from command towards the tail end of the Philadelphia campaign through the early stages of Valley Forge, something known as the Conway Cabal, because he's not trusted by everybody. The government doesn't fully trust him because he really hasn't won a significant victory. And the Philadelphia campaign does not help that cause He's not going to really win a significant victory in this campaign either. So it's sort of two very different men. One heavily trusted by his troops, one not so much. One that the government backs, one that the government doesn't really back. But the end of the campaign sort of changes all that. Howe's going to resign in frustration and go home. Washington's going to defeat the Conway cabal and solidify his command coming out of Valley Forge.
So as European troops are coming over to North America, you mentioned some of the different tactics that Howe had developed during the French Indian War, but how did things like infrastructure, road conditions affect how a European army would fight?
A great deal. The British Army relies heavily on their logistics, their lines of supply, going all the way back to England. So they rely on shipments of supplies, food, ammunition, equipment, new uniforms, coming over by sea, much of which could be spoiled or rotten before it even got here. And then the road conditions, there's there's no paved roads. There's some cobblestone streets in America's cities at the time, but all the country roads are dirt or mud in the rainy season. There's no rail lines, so you're relying. There's no canals, so you're relying heavily on shipments from sea or by river to resupply for the British Army. So they're hesitant to stray too far from a navigable river, which is why at the end of their sea voyage up the Chesapeake Bay, they're almost immediately making plans to get back to the Delaware River, which would turn into a new line of supply, because once they venture too far away from the Chesapeake, they lose their line of supply. And so it's a major hindrance for British forces operating in North America. They can't venture too far inland towards American supply bases or inland cities like Reading or Lancaster, because they would venture too far from their line of supply.
Now in the book, throughout the book, you list all the different units that were fighting during this campaign. And some of the British units have interesting names. One was a regiment of foot. What type of a unit was that? It's
just a standard infantry regiment. It's just they're to differentiate from a cavalry or dragoon regiment or an artillery regiment. An infantry regiment or a foot is what we would think of as an infantry regiment today. They march everywhere, they walk everywhere, and they fight basically shoulder to shoulder in lines of battle with muskets, with fixed bayonets.
Now another type of unit were the grenadiers.
Grenadier is an elite company or group of soldiers within a regiment of foot. So one of the 10 regiments within a regiment of foot was a grenadier company. I'm sorry, one of the 10 companies is a grenadier company. These were traditionally the taller men of the regiment. There was height requirements. They wore tall bearskin caps to make them sort of even more intimidating than they already were. And they're called grenadiers because earlier in history they actually carried a primitive form of grenade. Now that had been phased out prior to the Revolution, but the name stuck. And that what William Howe does, he actually took the grenadier companies from their parent regiments and brigaded them into their own battalions. So you had whole battalions of 15 and 16 companies of grenadiers detached from their parent regiments that fought as their own units. But they were an elite force within the British Army.
And we'll do one more here. So there were others called fusiliers.
Fusiliers traditionally were escorts for artillery columns or artillery regiments. That's not really how they're going to be used in the American Revolution, but that's where the name comes from, a Fusilier regiment. They're going to fight just like other infantry regiments in the Revolution and not really as escorts to artillery like they would have been used, say, in European wars.
Now, you also mentioned in the book, you talk about regimental colonels in the British system, that they're not necessarily the people who are commanding on the battlefield.
Correct. In fact, they rarely do, if ever. Colonels held honorary titles of general, and they would normally exercise that rank in campaigns. So, I'm trying to think of a good example. I believe John Burgoyne, hopefully I have this right, was the colonel of the 16th Light Dragoons. But he actually serves as a general commanding the Northern Army in the Saratoga campaign, and they're all like that. And I can't think of them all off the top of my head. But Charles Cornwallis was a colonel of a regiment, and William Howe was a colonel of a regiment, and their pay is actually based off being a colonel of a regiment, not based on being a general in a campaign.
And were these units, were these colonels professionally trained? How much merit was involved in their selection?
Some were. Some had gone to military schools in Europe, but not all. All ranks in the British Army were based off of purchase. So if you were from a wealthy family, you could buy a lieutenancy or a captaincy in a regiment. And then it was also a way to make money because you could sell that commission to buy a higher ranking commission if there was a vacancy. So it really depends. Some did go to military schools, especially in the artillery ranks. They went to artillery school. Some went to other schools in Europe. But you didn't have to have that military background to buy a commission in a British regiment.
Now, the British forces also included Germans, and we tend to just think of them as Hessians, but it was more complicated than that, right?
It's very complicated. Now, the bulk of the Germanic soldiers that served in the Philadelphia campaign are true Hessians from Hesse-Hanau or Hesse-Kassel, but there were other Germanic troops that served in America from Ansbach, from Waldeck, from Brunswick. And they sort of traditionally get called Hessian because the bulk of the troops that came over were true Hessians, but it's sort of a myth because they weren't all Hessians. But in the Philadelphia campaign, other than a couple Ansbach regiments and a company of Ansbach Jagers, they were all true Hessians.
How was the German military leadership different from the British military leadership?
It's not that different. They tend to be more trained, the Hessian officers in military schools. They tend to be more from nobility in the Hessian regiments, the officers do. But in terms of structure of regiments and role and function, it's not that drastically different from the British Army.
Now, the American side was made up of a variety of troops as well. There are often militia units that were part of these campaigns. Who raised the militia units?
The states, they were states at that point. The states had a militia system going back decades prior to the French and Indian War. The exception to that, and one that affects the Philadelphia campaign, is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania does not have an official militia law until early in 1777. The Quaker influence on the Pennsylvania government prior to that, because of their pacifism, did not create an official militia system. Now, there was an ad hoc group that you could call militia that were known as associators that sort of created their own military bodies, but they were not officially sanctioned by the government. And so the problem with the Pennsylvania militia, and it's going to affect the Philadelphia campaign, is there was no official system until right before the campaign begins. And so they were just sort of getting up to speed to creating militia roles at the county and township level. And there was exceptions to it, and they were still working out all those details and kinks. And so there was a huge issue with the Pennsylvania militia throughout the Philadelphia campaign.
Now, how did the Continental Congress's concerns about standing armies affect the relationship between militias and the development of Continental Army?
It does. The Continental Congress overall did not really want to create a long-standing traditional army in the European sense, something that Washington argues for throughout the war, that we need a permanent standing army and to not rely on militias. Now, the government, because of their democratic principles, want to rely more on militia forces to fight the war than a true standing army. Luckily, over time and through Washington's influence, that will sort of create a blend of using militia with Continental. In Washington's view, the issue with militia is they're not a permanent force. They come and go. They do a 30-day stint or a 60-day stint, and they rotate home and they're replaced by a new group of troops. And one of the problems with that is you might just starting to be getting those militia forces trained, and then they go home, the new crop comes in, and you got to train a whole new group of guys. And so it didn't create an effective fighting force or a permanent fighting force, which is why Washington really wanted to go with a permanent Continental force.
Now, a lot of the imagery surrounding the Continental Army, we're used to seeing soldiers wearing kind of a buff and blue uniform, but you say in the book that it was a little bit more varied than that. If we saw Washington's army marching through the streets or the roads of Pennsylvania, what would we have seen?
It's a real mix. Now, by regulation, by government regulation, the uniforms were supposed to be dependent upon what region of the country they came from. So, for example, the Mid-Atlantic troops, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and the Pennsylvania troops were supposed to wear blue with red facings or red trim. Virginia troops were supposed to wear blue with white facings, etc. And there's other examples of that. But they were almost never fully equipped with what they were supposed to wear. So some of the troops might actually be wearing what they were supposed to wear. Some might be wearing militia uniforms from before the war or earlier in the war. Others might be just wearing what they had at home, hunting frocks or their civilian clothing, because the Army was never properly uniformed at this point of the war.
Now, you also talk about during some of these battles that there were some units, that Continental units, wearing red uniforms.
Yeah, actually, there's instances where supply ships for the British Army are captured by privateers, and then they would find either uniforms or bolts of cloth for making British uniforms that they would convert into Continental uniforms, just because the American troops were so desperate for clothing. So there's definitely instances of that. I know there's troops within the 4th Light Dragoons that were supposed to wear, I think it's green uniforms off the top of my head, but they were wearing captured uniforms of the 16th Light Dragoons of the British Army, which created confusion several times during the campaign.
So as Howe's forces leave New York by boat, do they come up the Delaware River, or do they? Some of them go up the Chesapeake River. Or Chesapeake Bay?
Initially, they do enter the Delaware, the Delaware Bay, I should say, at the end of July 1777. But because of some false information they get, intelligence they get there, they do not continue up the Delaware. They choose to go back out to sea. The whole fleet does. And it's going to cause them to spend roughly another month at sea, going around the Delmarva Peninsula and up the Chesapeake Bay, before landing at the end of August near modern Elkton, Maryland.
So once Howe's troops are ashore there at Elkton, where do they go?
There's some initial maneuvering through northeastern Maryland and northern Delaware. There's a minor engagement at a place called Couch's Bridge in northern Delaware on the Christiana River. And then the two armies are going to maneuver out of northern Delaware, roughly parallel to each other, up opposite sides of the Brandywine River, crossing the Delaware state line into Pennsylvania. The American Army will on the September 9th. The British Army kind of between September 9th and 10th. They cross the state line and form up Washington's army roughly in the Chadds Ford area, and the British Army will camp in Kennett Square.
Now, when Howe's forces left New York, did George Washington have any idea where they were going?
Not initially. The lack or the limited size of the Continental Navy does not allow them to really follow where that fleet goes, that British fleet. So they're going to rely upon spotters along the coastline to hopefully spot the fleet from the coastline. And it'll take a while. It won't be till they are spotted passing Little Egg Harbor on the New Jersey shore that Washington shifts from basically the Hudson River Valley and starts marching south across northern New Jersey. And then it becomes known that they do enter the Delaware Bay briefly, and Washington starts to concentrate in the Trenton area. But when they go back out to sea around the Delmarva Peninsula, it's going to take them a while to realize what the British are doing. And so Washington hesitates camping along the Neshaminy Creek north of Philadelphia for a significant period of time. And it's not till they are fairly well up the Chesapeake before he realizes that they're heading towards the upper Chesapeake and marches down through Philadelphia and basically starts to enter northern Delaware the same day the British are offloading near Elkton, Maryland.
So how was Washington approaching Howe's forces? Was he planning to directly attack them, or was he more harassing them?
It's a good question. From most of the early phases of the campaign, it's about harassment. He's not prepared. He knows his army's not ready to bring on an assault, an offensive operation. So they're using small-scale operations to slow down the British forces, especially when they were still in northern New Jersey. He'll do that again in northern Delaware, northeastern Maryland. And then he He realizes politically he can't give up Philadelphia without a fight. But he wants to fight a defensive battle, so he wants to use a natural barrier to force the British to cross a water body against, in the face of his troops. So he tries to do that behind the Red Clay Creek in northern Delaware, but William Howe doesn't want any part of that, and that's why they cross into Pennsylvania. The Brandywine River is the next opportunity for that, a natural barrier that you would need to use a ford, a shallow spot to cross. And so Washington uses the hills on the east side of the Brandywine, defending the fords he knew about, to try to force the British into an assault against his forces.
Now, you wrote a book on the Battle of the Brandywine as well. You've been on this program to talk about that. What was significant about that battle?
Washington basically gets flanked again. That's off the top of my head the 6th or 7th time William Howe does it to him. And that battle, that loss for Washington is going to directly lead to the capture of Philadelphia. Now, there's some other minor things that are going to take place between September 11th and September 26th that I do cover in the new book. But ultimately, that loss is what leads to the capture of Philadelphia.
Now, you mentioned these flanking movements that Howe had made. Should Washington have been able to predict those?
He should have, because it wasn't a new tactic that Howe had done. Howe did it to him at Long Island. He did it to him at White Plains. He does it to him at Couch's Bridge. He does it to him in northern Delaware. It wasn't a new maneuver. He should at least have been looking for it. And one of the reasons I fault Washington for Brandywine is there were intelligence reports the morning of the battle coming in that there was a flanking column out there. And Washington hesitates and waits, in my opinion, entirely too long to react to those reports. And when he does, it's too late, and he ends up in a defeat there.
Now, before the actual battle in Germantown took place, from Brandywine, there was a lot of maneuvering in Pennsylvania. How did George Washington make a decision what to do, whether to protect Philadelphia or protect his sources of supply?
It couldn't have been an easy decision. Now, he doesn't actually write about it, so we can only surmise. But he's basically left with a horrendous decision. Politically, from the Continental Congress's point of view, he can't give up Philadelphia without a fight. But at the same time, he gets maneuvered into a position where he's left with moving to protect Philadelphia or moving to protect supply bases in the Pennsylvania backcountry, places like York, Lancaster, Reading, even Bethlehem. Because if he maneuvers to protect those, he's giving up Philadelphia. However, if he maneuvers to protect Philadelphia, he's going to lose those backcountry settlements, those major supply centers. And ultimately, Howe's still going to come for Philadelphia whether or not Washington moves to protect those backcountry. And so he's left with a decision that he's forced to give up Philadelphia without a second fight because he needs to protect those backcountry settlements, which in his mind militarily are more important than Philadelphia. And he is right about that.
Now, your book is filled with quotes from letters, journals, diaries. A lot of the participants in this campaign seem to write a lot.
Thankfully, otherwise it would be an impossible task. So it's mostly officers, unfortunately. Lots of diaries or letters home can be found in archives today or different libraries. There's not as much from the enlisted, lower-ranking men. Very few of that stuff's. If they did write, very little of it survives or has been found. But you could never tell the story without those diaries and letters.
So when there's a defeat of the Continental Army, such as at Brandywine, how does the Continental Congress react to something like that?
Not well. They actually initiate, both after Brandywine, after the Battle of the Clouds, and also after Paoli, there is investigations launched, sometimes by Congress, sometimes by the Army under pressure from Congress, through courts of inquiries or court martials of certain officers, trying to find blame for the defeats. So there's especially after Brandywine, there's anger from North Carolina congressman named, of course I can't think of it. There's a congressman from North Carolina who initiates an investigation and leads to the court martial of John Sullivan, who this congressman blames for the defeat at Brandywine. It's not John Sullivan's fault. It's one of the division commanders, but that leads to a court-martial. General Wayne is going to face a court-martial for the Battle of Paoli. There's another one. General Maxwell is accused of drunkenness at Brandywine in the Battle of the Clouds. He's going to face a court-martial. And I know we haven't gotten to Germantown yet, but Adam Stephen, another division commander, is going to face a court-martial for drunkenness at Germantown as well.
So after Brandywine, did Washington's forces retreat in disarray? Did Howe follow up? What happened?
Luckily, they do. It's not a route, it's not like a route, if you're familiar with the Civil War, like a first Bull Run route where it's just utter chaos. They do somewhat orderly retreat, mostly down the same road to Chester the night after the battle. Washington's able to sort of regroup the next morning and retreat further. So it's not like the Army completely falls apart and he can't get the regiments back together. That's not the case. By the next morning, most of the Army is regrouped, and they're going to start retreating to the north side of the Schuylkill River.
Now, there were two other smaller battles that took place between Brandywine and Germantown. You mentioned one of them, the Battle of the Clouds. What was that?
So Washington's going to maneuver. Let me back up. William Howe stays on the Brandywine battlefield for 5 days, both regrouping, gathering supplies from the countryside because he's got those supply issues. He also wants to occupy Wilmington, Delaware, to await the fleet that's coming back around the Delmarva Peninsula. He needs a port for the fleet to meet up with him. He sends his wounded to Wilmington. He sends the American prisoners from the battle to Wilmington. So that takes some time. It's a 5-day period. And then he's going to start moving north towards the Schuylkill River. The Washington, during that 5-day period, is moving a lot. Initially, they moved north of the Schuylkill River to regroup and sort of lick their wounds in the Germantown area before remaneuvering to block Howe's path to the Schuylkill River. Because much like the Brandywine, he wants to block Howe's access to the Schuylkill River fords because he can't get to Philadelphia without crossing the Schuylkill. It's important to realize that Philadelphia at the time was a much smaller city than it is today, and it sat on a peninsula formed by the Delaware and the Schuylkill River. So you had to cross the Schuylkill to get to Philadelphia. And so Washington regroups, recrosses the Schuylkill River where Manayunk is today, and then he maneuvers out roughly what's today modern-day Route 30 to get in a blocking position roughly where Immaculata College is today, to block the road juncture to the Schuylkill River fords. And so the day Howe is leaving the Brandywine region, he's moving up these roads towards where Immaculata College is today, while Washington is sort of moving south into a blocking position. And they get into this what's known as a meeting engagement. They weren't expecting to find each other that day, and they run into each other on two different roads on what's known as the South Valley Hills, just south of Immaculata College. And you have this sort of running fight develops and a rainstorm at the same time. That's why it's called the Battle of the Clouds. A massive, what we now believe is a nor'easter, breaks out, a massive rainstorm, soaks the ammunition of both armies, making the guns useless. And so Washington actually finds himself in a bad spot because the roads are turning into quagmires. His army's not fully deployed, and most of his army is stacked up on roads in the Great Valley below the hills, and he needs to get them out of there because he has no ammunition. The British are bearing down on him with bayonets, and if he doesn't get his army out of this quagmire, it's going to turn bad. Luckily, the British do not pursue because of the muddy roads, and Washington's able to extricate his army out of the bad situation.
Now, the other battle that occurred between Brandywine and Germantown was Paoli, often called a massacre of Anthony Wayne's troops. What happened there?
So Washington pulls out of there to get to a resupply of ammunition, initially to the far northwestern corner of Chester County, but he leaves Anthony Wayne's division behind. The plan sort of is, there's a couple reasons Wayne's left behind. There's Maryland militia that are marching up from the Oxford area, Oxford, PA area, that, coming up from Maryland. They need somebody to link up with that Maryland militia. But he also wants to harass William Howe when he starts to move towards the Schuylkill River fords. So Wayne is going to maneuver into the modern Malvern area for two reasons: to wait for the Maryland militia, and then when Howe starts to move towards the Schuylkill River fords, to attack his rear as they're trying to cross the Schuylkill River. At least that was the plan. Meanwhile, Washington resupplies, maneuvers north of the Schuylkill River again to block the Schuylkill River fords between roughly Norristown and Phoenixville today, and wait for Howe to move. Well, Howe, there's a lot of loyalists in the Chester County area, or people that were loyal to the British Crown. Well, they know Wayne is back where he's at. And so they inform Howe of this force that's behind his camps. And so Howe realizes he can't maneuver towards the Schuylkill until he deals with Wayne's force. And so he orders a column under Charles Gray to attack that camp in the middle of the night of the, I hope I'm getting these dates right. I think it's the night of the 20th and the 21st. I hope I have that right. To attack that camp. And Wayne actually gets forewarned of it. His pickets come in and tell him that the British are coming. And they actually, one of the myths of the battle is that they're caught in bed. They're not caught in bed. His division is actually awake, clothed, uniform, like equipped, and they get into a column to march out of there before they get attacked. The problem is there was a fence line between his camp and the road out of there. And there was an opening in the fence line, but as the artillery is pulling through the opening, one of the artillery pieces overturns and blocks the avenue of escape. And so his division is lined up in a column to march, and they get attacked at the rear end of the column by the British, because they're not deployed for battle. And so it becomes a massacre because it's the middle of the night, it's dark, Americans are getting bayoneted as the British are sweeping through this column, and that's why it becomes a massacre, not so much because they weren't awake. They weren't in a position to fight. They were in a position to march, and then their escape route got blocked.
So at what point does Howe decide to go for Philadelphia?
Well, the whole campaign was about going for Philadelphia. I don't think Howe was ever going to go for those backcountry settlements. He does tell the British government he's going to do that, but he really can't because he can't get away from his river routes. So, but ultimately he goes for Philadelphia after he gets across the Schuylkill River. So with the Wayne threat eliminated, Howe maneuvers the morning after the Battle of Paoli. They maneuver into where the Valley Forge encampment will later take place. Washington now has to make a decision. Do I defend Philadelphia? Do I defend the backcountry? He chooses to defend the backcountry. So he's going to maneuver away from the Schuylkill River fords, opening up those access points across the Schuylkill for the British Army. They will cross the Schuylkill River on September 23rd at a place called Fatland Ford. It's roughly behind where the chapel is today in Valley Forge Park. They will maneuver into the Norristown area, camp for a night. On the 25th, they will maneuver into Germantown, down Germantown, what's today Germantown Avenue, and camp at Germantown. And then on the morning of the 26th, a British column under Charles Cornwallis will occupy Philadelphia.
So once the British troops get into Philadelphia, was the Royal Navy waiting for them, or were they still in the Chesapeake Bay?
No. At this point, by the time they occupy Philadelphia, the Royal elements of the fleet have now come back around from the Chesapeake. The rest of it will soon join them, and they will, they're basically down roughly where Wilmington is. Some of them are starting to maneuver up towards where Chester, Pennsylvania is today, but they cannot access Philadelphia, which is a huge problem for William Howe. There was a series of defenses that the Americans had in place to prevent the British fleet from coming up the Delaware River. There was 3 fortifications, one at a place called Billingsport, which is where modern Paulsboro, New Jersey is today. There was another one on the New Jersey side called Fort Mercer, which is basically directly across the river from the Philadelphia airport today, and a third one on what was then an island, a fort called Fort Mifflin, which is literally right next to where the Philadelphia airport is today. And then there was a series of sunken obstructions in the river called chevaux de frise that were chained together. And they could stop ships from coming up the river. And so the forts were positioned to prevent the British from removing the chevaux de frise. They were like the anchor ports for those obstructions. And so the fleet could not get to the river at this point.
So the Continental Army had experienced defeats at Brandywine and the Battle of the Clouds and Paoli. Why did Washington decide to take offensive action at Germantown?
That's $1 million question. I think he's under a great deal of political pressure. At this point, Horatio Gates has won the first Battle of Saratoga. And so there was a lot of accolades coming from the Northern Continental Army, which are subordinate to him technically. But the commander of that Northern Army is getting a lot of praise. There's a lot of pressure on Washington to get a win because negotiations with the French government are ongoing for the alliance. And then William Howe makes a series of decisions that weakened his main army. Remember when they were down at Brandywine, he sent a garrison to Wilmington. So that was a detachment from the main army. Then he sends a very large detachment to occupy Philadelphia. So they are detached from the main army. And then 3 days before the Battle of Germantown, 2 more regiments are detached to go seize that fortification at Billingsport I mentioned previously. So the army or the force that's left with William Howe in Germantown is a much weaker one than the one he attacked Washington with at Brandywine. And so Washington sees an opportunity. His theory, I think, is if he could destroy that force at Germantown, I might be able to get in a position to bottle up the Cornwallis force in Philadelphia by setting up some sort of a line on that peninsula, that, create a line between the Schuylkill and the Delaware rivers and block Cornwallis's force in Philadelphia, because remember, the Americans still control the forts at this point. And so that, I think, was the plan, was to crush that force in Germantown and then basically besiege and starve out Cornwallis in Philadelphia.
Did the fact that Howe had moved his troops into Philadelphia give George Washington any breathing room in terms of preparing his troops?
In some sense, because Howe becomes very preoccupied with the need to open up the Delaware River to his fleet, or to technically his brother's fleet. His brother's the admiral of the fleet, Richard Howe. And he's not really concerned with sending out expeditions to harass Washington at this point. So in a sense, yes, Washington has roughly, let me think about this, from the time Howe occupies Germantown to the battle, there's about I'm trying to do the math real quick. It's about a 9-day period or an 8-day period. So Washington has some time to regroup. He'll spend quite a bit of time at a camp near Faulkner Swamp, which is roughly near modern-day Hagley'sville, sort of northwestern Montgomery County today. Regrouping, getting recruits in, getting some reinforcements from the Northern Army. The Maryland and New Jersey militia will join his army. He will then slowly maneuver down into an area known as the Methacton Hills. It's outside of modern Trapp today, where he makes the ultimate decision to assault. But he's allowed to do all that without any harassment from Howe. So in a sense, the occupation of Philadelphia does give Washington some breathing room.
Now, Washington would come up with a plan where he had 4 different columns moving separately to attack Germantown. Was that something that he was confident that the Continental Army could achieve?
I don't know how he could have been confident with it. It's super ambitious. He attempts something similar for the Battle of Trenton the previous year. Off the top of my head, again, I'm not my area of expertise, but there's 3 or 4 columns that are supposed to attack Trenton that day, and 2 of them never even crossed the Delaware River. So he had attempted this before, and it didn't work. although he does find victory, Trenton, don't get me wrong. But the idea of getting 4 columns to one spot, without radios and GPS and the internet, to do this with stopwatches or, pocket watches, and the timing of it is stunning. Plus, they're going to do it overnight, march all night, to come down 4 different roads and hit the British camp from 4 different points at the same time. It was stunningly aggressive and optimistic. And the shocking thing is, they pull off that part of the battle plan. I would bet within 15, 20 minutes, all 4 columns got to where they were supposed to get to and start attacking the British camp.
So at that point, on the morning of October 4th, which was the first American column to enter into combat?
That's debatable. Again, I actually think they all attack within about 15 minutes of each other, but the very first one to finally hit is probably John Sullivan's column. They had marched down, for those of our viewers that are familiar with the region, they marched down what's today modern Route 73 to the intersection of Bethlehem Pike. They go down Bethlehem Pike into Chestnut Hill, the village of Chestnut Hill, and then that's where they make the left onto what's today Germantown Avenue, and then they will start their assault on the Mount Airy section of the city today, which was just sort of a cluster of houses at the time. But first contact is made on the hill Mount Airy, sort of between Chestnut Hill and Germantown proper.
Were the British surprised?
Yes, stunningly. Even though there were reports that came in overnight, and there is evidence in the British documents and diaries that some elements of the army were aware that the Americans were coming. Some elements of the army had actually been alerted and told to get up. But Washington gets a little lucky because the elements of the British army that John Sullivan hits were not alerted and were not out of bed. And so they do catch the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion by surprise, and they're going to have some great, phenomenal initial success in the battle.
How far did the American troops get in that early period?
Pretty far. The 2 main Continental columns under John Sullivan and Nathaniel Greene's column that's going to come down Lime Kiln Pike, they are going to crush basically the entire right flank of the British Army and drive them almost to Market Square in Germantown, which is still there today. The other 2 elements, which were both militia columns, don't have as much success and don't drive in the left flank of the British camp, but those 2 Continental columns had an amazing amount of success and drive it's a couple miles that they drive the British force.
So given that the Continental Army had not had a lot of success in its past, did they know what to do once things were going their way?
There's a lot of confusion. It's a good question. And there's multiple reasons for the confusion. The 2 most obvious are there was an incredible amount of dense smoke, or not smoke combined with dense fog that morning. And so these American units that have success, they start to get to the point where they can't see what's in front of them. And they don't realize how far they're driving the British forces. There's a lot, and then that's going to lead to a lot of musket volleys shot at nothing. And so there starts to become an ammunition issue for those frontline units that did the initial attack. And they start to run out of ammo. And then they also need to regroup because they start to sort of bump into each other in the smoke. There's friendly fire incidents. And there's a lot of confusion for those units that had the initial success. And in the midst of that confusion, Washington actually, I think, planned to rotate fresh troops to the front. He had a fresh division of North Carolina and New Jersey troops that had not been engaged yet. And I actually think that they were meant to rotate forward because they were fully supplied with ammunition to continue the attack and to continue to drive the British force. But prior to the deployment of that fresh division, the 3rd problem, so you have the fog, running out of ammunition, and then the 3rd problem was a single regiment of British troops during the retreat, at least parts of that regiment, the 40th Regiment of Foot, ran into Benjamin Chew's country house, known as Cliveden, barricaded the first floor and started shooting at elements of the Continental Army that's marching up the Germantown Avenue, which is, I don't know, 150 yards from the house. And so a huge heated debate is going to take place about what to do with Cliveden, which is going to turn the whole tide of the battle.
Now, you mentioned that he held a council of war at this point. In the middle of a battle like that, should he be holding a council of war, or should he just be making a decision on the fly?
That is a great question. Should he be doing it in the middle of a battle? My opinion, no. You're the commander-in-chief of the Army. You need to make a decision, and there's no time to waste. That said, he has a long history of councils of war to get a consensus, in a sense, of what the right decision is. Had he done it during a battle previously, off the top of my head, I want to say no. And it's a huge mistake here, I think. And the debate basically boils down to, I believe, between Henry Knox, the chief of artillery, and Timothy Pickering, who is the Army's adjutant general. He's the senior staff officer for Washington. And Knox basically is endorsing this idea that you can't leave a castle in your rear. And he's referring to the stone house at Cliveden, that you can't leave those troops there, that we have to deal with those before continuing the battle. Pickering takes the opposite view. Pickering says we leave one regiment to keep an eye on that house and to keep those guys from coming out of that house, and the rest of the Army moves forward. I believe Pickering was right. That regiment shooting out the windows was not going to stop a fresh division from marching up the road. It was just not going to happen. But Washington chooses to listen to Knox, and the whole battle turns into a debacle as they attempt to deal with Cliveden.
Now, at some point during the battle, Howe's forces mount a counterattack. Did he anticipate that there would be a counterattack? Was he prepared for it?
I'm going to say no, he was not, because they became so preoccupied with Cliveden. And what happens is a series of events take place at Cliveden. First, they try to pound the house with artillery, but the house has got very thick stone walls, and the artillery did nothing to the house, like other than shatter windows, blow in the front door, destroy the statuary that was, it was a country home that was in the yard. But it doesn't drive the British out. So then 2 regiments of New Jersey Continentals, the 1st and the 3rd, charge up the carriageway, the driveway of the house to assault the house, which is just an insane scene if you think about it. And that doesn't work as they're getting picked off from the 2nd floor windows. They're getting shot down in the yard. And then what happens is the units that were on the front lines, John Sullivan's troops and Anthony Wayne's troops and Adam Stevens' troops that had driven the British in towards Market Square, hear all the shooting going on to their rear. And so elements of the front line units start to reverse course to go deal with this shooting they hear behind them. And so now you have units peeling away from the fighting with the main British force. And so when the British were able to regroup and counterattack, those frontline troops were out of ammunition, and most of them were already moving towards the rear. And so they were completely unprepared for the counterattack.
So as the American troops then responded to the counterattack, was it an organized retreat?
I'm going to say it was a retreat similar to the way they retreated from Brandywine. It wasn't a disorganized rout where there was no command structure whatsoever. But I also don't want to say they retreated as whole brigades or whole divisions, but they definitely kept their regimental structures together as they fell back. There is a rear guard action that's going to take place near White Marsh Church, where the intersection of Route 73 and Bethlehem Pike is today. So it's not a disorganized route, but they're also not capable of really trying to stand up to the British at this point.
So even though this would end up being a defeat for the American forces, they did have some successes in terms of coordinating the 4 columns and initial success in the battle. Mm-hmm. What did they take away from this?
That they could stand the toe-to-toe with the British. that they're not as bad of a fighting force as the British think they are. And the British, the journals that you read in the British officer corps in the aftermath of the battle were somewhat stunned. They're going to have to respect Washington a little bit more after this. So they're close. Now, Valley Forge will put them over the top, the training they're going to get at Valley Forge, but they're getting there. Brandywine kind of started them on that process. Germantown was another step in that direction. And then when they come out of Valley Forge, they're a respectable fighting force that's going to fight at Monmouth.
So with this battle, Germantown occurring similar around the same time that Saratoga was taking place, what's a larger strategic effect of these battles?
The strategic effect is it's going to lead to the French alliance. Now, everybody credits, rightfully so, Saratoga leading to that French alliance. But if you look at the writings of the French foreign minister and John Adams, who's over there, and Ben Franklin, who are negotiating the alliance, if you look at their writings, they all credit Germantown equally with Saratoga, with that sort of pushing the French to that last hurdle of signing the alliance. And the reasoning is they were impressed that Washington launched an offensive attack against the main British army. It was the first time Washington does that, because the attack at Trenton was against a detachment of the British army, not the main British force. So the fact that he was, even though he lost, that willingness to launch that assault, that offensive attack, was impressive enough, combined with Saratoga, to push the French over the edge to create the alliance.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Howe would eventually resign. Did this battle influence his resignation?
That's a good question. I think it was a combination of factors. I don't want to say it was just Germantown. He's frustrated with the British government. I think he's frustrated with what happened to John Burgoyne, even though he has some blame for that himself. He feels like he's not being supported by the British government. He's always asking for significant numbers of reinforcements. And he feels that the fact the British government doesn't give him what he wants, he's never going to achieve success, and he doesn't want to be responsible for losing the war. So I don't want to say it's just Germantown. I think he was already frustrated with what he felt was a lack of support by the British government. So he actually sends in his resignation letter not long after Germantown, but he sticks around. He doesn't actually leave until it's either late May or early June 1778, so he's there the whole winter. And he will actually launch another offensive effort in December. And he's also responsible for the taking down of the British or the Delaware River forts that lead to British access to the city by the Navy. So he's going to be there for the rest of the campaign, even though he resigns.
Well, Michael Harris is the author of the book Germantown, A Military History of the Battle of Philadelphia, October 4th, 1777. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.